Have you ever wondered why some people seem fine on the surface, yet therapists sense something deeply wrong within seconds? It's because therapists don't listen only to words. They listen to patterns, the pauses, the contradictions, the emotions that don't match the story. Most people hear what's said. Therapists notice what's avoided. And avoidance always reveals more than honesty. Therapists notice how quickly someone explains themselves. When a person rushes to justify every action, it's rarely confidence. It's fear of being misunderstood. People who feel safe don't over-explain. Over-explaining is often a survival habit learned when no one believed you the first time. Most people think confidence looks loud. Therapists know it's usually quiet. The loudest voices in the room often belong to the most uncertain minds. Real confidence doesn't need to dominate. It allows silence without panic. One of the first things therapists notice is how someone talks about their past. Not the events themselves, but the emotional distance. When someone tells a painful story with no emotion, it often means the pain was never processed, only buried. Therapists pay attention to what people laugh at. Nervous laughter often appears right after something painful is mentioned. It's not humor, it's a shield. The mind trying to escape discomfort before it becomes too real. Most people miss how often someone says, "I don't know." Therapists don't. Sometimes "I don't know" means confusion. Other times, it means knowing feels too dangerous. Awareness can be threatening when it forces change. Therapists notice patterns in relationships long before the person does. Repeating the same conflicts with different people is never about bad luck. It's about unhealed attachment wounds replaying themselves. People believe anger is the problem. Therapists know anger is usually the protector. Underneath it is often sadness, shame, or fear that once went unheard. Anger learned to speak, because nothing else was allowed to. Therapists notice when someone constantly blames themselves. It often isn't accountability, it's control. If everything is your fault, at least the world feels predictable. Chaos feels safer when you think you caused it. They notice how people react to kindness. If someone becomes uncomfortable when treated gently, it's often because gentleness was absent early in life. The nervous system doesn't trust what it didn't grow up with. Most people miss how often someone minimizes their pain. Therapists hear it immediately. Phrases like, "It wasn't that bad," usually mean it was. Minimization is how trauma convinces you to stay silent. Therapists pay attention to boundaries, or the lack of them. People who never say no often believe love must be earned through sacrifice. They learned early that needs were inconvenient. They notice when someone intellectualizes emotions. Turning feelings into theories is often a way to avoid actually feeling. Understanding pain is safer than experiencing it. Therapists notice inconsistency between words and body language. Someone may say they're calm while their shoulders stay tense. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Most people think trauma looks dramatic. Therapists know it often looks ordinary. High-functioning, productive, responsible. Trauma doesn't always break people. Sometimes it turns them into perfectionists. Therapists notice how people describe others. Excessive judgment often hides self-criticism. The mind projects what it hasn't forgiven within itself. They notice when someone struggles to accept help. Independence can be strength, but it can also be armor built when reliance once led to disappointment. Therapists notice repetition in language. The same phrases, the same stories, the same conclusions. Repetition reveals the core belief running the person's life. Most people miss how fear disguises itself as logic. Therapists don't. "I'm just being realistic" often translates to "I'm afraid to hope." They notice how someone handles uncertainty. People who need constant certainty often grew up in unpredictable environments. Control became safety. Therapists notice guilt that doesn't belong to the present. When guilt is chronic, it's usually inherited from the past. Someone once made you responsible for emotions that weren't yours. They notice when someone avoids eye contact during certain topics. The nervous system reacts before the mind can lie. Therapists notice the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness feels empty. Solitude feels full. People stuck in loneliness often learned to disconnect to survive. They notice how quickly someone forgives others. Immediate forgiveness can sometimes be avoidance. Healing requires anger to be felt, not skipped. Most people miss the way shame hides in politeness. Over-apologizing, over-agreeing, over-accommodating. Shame teaches people to take up less space. Therapists notice when someone fears being a burden. That fear doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from being treated like one. They notice when success doesn't bring relief. Achievement doesn't heal wounds. It only distracts from them. Therapists notice how people react to silence. Silence makes unresolved thoughts louder. That's why many people avoid it. They notice when someone confuses intensity with connection. Trauma bonds feel deep, but depth without safety is not love. Therapists notice the stories people tell about themselves. Identity is built from repetition. Change begins when the story changes. They notice when someone fears rest. Constant productivity is often a trauma response, not ambition. Most people miss how sadness can hide behind motivation. Therapists see it clearly. They notice when someone feels responsible for fixing others. That role is usually learned, not chosen. Therapists notice how people react to mistakes. Extreme self-punishment points to conditional love in the past. They notice when someone avoids vulnerability by being the strong one. Strength became survival, not preference. Therapists notice when someone says, "I'm used to it." Familial pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace. They notice emotional numbness, not as absence, but overload. The system shut down to survive. Therapists notice when someone fears happiness. Joy can feel dangerous when loss followed it before. They notice when logic is used to suppress intuition. The body often knows before the mind allows it. Therapists notice how people treat themselves in private. Self-talk reveals the inner environment more than any story. They notice when someone confuses self-worth with usefulness. Being needed replaced being loved. Therapists notice when people stay in pain longer than necessary. Familiar suffering feels predictable. They notice when someone feels guilty for healing. Growth can feel like betrayal to old versions of the self. Therapists notice when someone fears becoming like their parents. That fear itself often shapes identity. They notice when people chase closure. Closure isn't something others give, it's something you allow. Therapists notice when someone avoids anger. Anger isn't dangerous. Suppressed anger is. They notice when someone confuses peace with boredom. Chaos once felt like home. Therapists notice how often people doubt their own perceptions. Gaslighting teaches people to mistrust reality. They notice when someone is tired beyond sleep. Emotional exhaustion doesn't rest, it heals. And the biggest thing therapists notice that most people miss. Healing doesn't come from fixing yourself. It comes from finally listening to yourself without judgment. That's when everything begins to change. Therapists notice how people react when they're believed. Some soften. Others grow uneasy. Being believed can feel foreign when you've spent years defending your reality. Safety itself can feel suspicious to a nervous system trained in doubt. They notice when someone mistakes emotional familiarity for truth. Just because a feeling is familiar doesn't mean it's accurate. Trauma repeats itself by disguising itself as instinct. Therapists notice when people apologize for having emotions. That apology reveals a past where feelings were treated as problems instead of signals. They notice how people describe love. When love sounds exhausting, it often has been. When love feels conditional, someone once made it so. Therapists notice when someone is more compassionate to strangers than to themselves. Self-kindness can feel undeserved when worth had to be earned. They notice the fear behind control. Controlling behavior often grew from a time when chaos felt unbearable. Control became protection. Therapists notice when people feel uncomfortable being seen. Visibility once led to criticism, so invisibility felt safer. They notice when someone intellectualizes their childhood. Explaining pain is easier than grieving it. Therapists notice when people confuse loyalty with self-abandonment. Staying at your own expense isn't devotion, it's conditioning. They notice when someone fears slowing down. Stillness brings memories. Movement keeps them buried. Therapists notice when people chase certainty in relationships. That need often comes from emotional unpredictability earlier in life. They notice how often people blame timing instead of patterns. Timing is convenient. Patterns require responsibility. Therapists notice when people fear anger from others. That fear usually began when anger meant danger, not disagreement. They notice when someone feels guilty for wanting more. Desire can feel selfish when survival required settling. Therapists notice when people fear abandonment yet push others away. Protection and longing can coexist. They notice when someone confuses being needed with being loved. Being needed feels safer because it feels guaranteed. Therapists notice how people respond to praise. Deflecting it often reveals a self-image built on criticism. They notice when someone stays hyper-alert in calm environments. Peace can feel unfamiliar when vigilance was necessary. Therapists notice when people avoid naming their needs. Needs were once ignored, so expecting less felt safer. And one of the quietest truths therapists see. People don't need to be taught how to heal. They need permission to stop fighting themselves. Healing begins when self-judgment ends.